like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules today to be with us, and I hope you did enjoy your light lunch and are ready to engage in the art of conversation regarding this very important, both historical and political topic dealing with the Arab constitution. As you well know, the issue of constitutions in the Arab world and the Muslim world to a certain extent is not new. We've been dealing with these issues for a long time, at least going back to the Ottoman period when the first versions, if you will, of something that could be called constitutional documents were allowed, the mid-1800s, 1870s, and so on. But recently, I think the subject has taken kind of a new life of its own, particularly with Arab Spring, that has revitalized the interest, particularly by Arabs in the Arab world, of their legal, if you will, background, or the constitutional background of their governance. Of course, the reaction, typical of the whole reaction to Arab Spring, was not uniform necessarily throughout the Arab world, no, not even uniform in the countries that went through different upheaval almost at the same time, generally speaking. So people are still analyzing as to whether there is a pattern of some sort that has emerged as a result of Arab Spring. They refer sometimes to this dual pattern of, like Morocco and Jordan on one side, and Egypt and Tunisia on the other side, and they kind of build all kinds of theoretical models and interpretation of what has taken place. So that the topic is exciting, and it's a bit complicated, and we're delighted to have two people with us who are definitely equipped and have done a lot of research on the issue, and we're grateful for their presence here with us today to shed some light on the topic. First, let me introduce Dr. Nathan Brown, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University, and member of the Arab Center Washington Academic Advisory Board. Mai El-Sadany, non-resident fellow for legal and judicial analysis at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. They both were actually generous enough to share some thoughts in advance regarding this conversation, in the sense that they both have written recently on the topic. Nathan has written recently for the Sharia project over at Harvard University, an extensive paper on the subject. I would recommend that you pursue it. Look for it on the web and take a look at the full paper. Excerpts of it are available in your folder, courtesy of the author. And he will be discussing some of the main kind of findings, if you will, of that whole research project that he has engaged in over the past year. Mai has also written a paper mostly focusing, if you will, on the human right division of Arab constitutions and how that is factored in the attempt to write new constitutions or amended constitution throughout various countries in the Arab world, and will be sharing with us today some of the key findings of her survey with regards to Arab uprisings and their impact on the constitution project, if you will, or writing of constitutions in the Arab world. You may follow the conversation on Twitter at Arab Center WDC, and what we'll do is we'll give both speakers a chance to kind of present the highlights of their findings, about 5 minutes each, and then we will engage in conversation between them with regards to comments and feedback regarding each other's comments. I will intervene if necessary to kind of generate some questions, if you will, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, and your role will be appreciated during that time. We do have microphones. We will pass those on to you if you just signal with raising your hand, and staff will pass a microphone to you, And your, again, short comments or questions preferably would be more than welcome. Nathan?
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Khalil, for having me over here. It's good to be over here. And thanks also for inviting May, who actually is an old friend. I've known her for about 10 years or so, I think. But because we're in Washington, our paths cross about once a year. Too enthusiastic with my motions here for the microphone? Or? Okay. Okay.
Technical difficulties for a moment. You should overcome them.
I'll try to hold still, maybe. So I thought what I would do, the topic of the paper that this my talk is based on is on religious provisions in Arab constitutions. But I thought I'd start not with the Arab world, but with the United States, because it often informs an awful lot of discussions of constitution making, not simply here, but elsewhere, where it's presumed that constitutions are about sort of defining the basic mechanisms of the state on a secular basis, that what constitutions appropriately do is establish a firm separation, or Jefferson's famous phrase, a wall of separation between church and state. But I'll start not simply with the United States, but with my middle school classroom, where, to get narcissistic just for a moment, where I remember being taught, and I don't know if this was true at the time, and I don't know if it's any longer true, but that the longest word in the English language is anti-disestablishmentarianism. Now, again, longer words may have been invented since then, but at least when I was in middle school, that was the word, and that's a word that actually perfectly fits Arab constitutions, which I'll get to in a moment and explain exactly why. The American Constitution, as originally drafted, mentioned religion only once, no religious test for public office. But then after they'd written it, they immediately amended it to put in the establishment clause, which is at the heart of the anti-disestablishmentarianism word. And it's about Congress shall make no law establishing a national religion. And so that's kind of a little bit of the origin of kind of the prejudice. If you think about it, actually, even the First Amendment as written does not prohibit established religions elsewhere. And in fact, there were local communities that had established religions into the 19th century into the United States. And of course, any time a country decides that religion is one thing and politics is another, it has to draw the line. And an awful lot of First Amendment jurisprudence on that is exactly where you draw the line. So states actually get very involved. When they say we're not going to deal with religion, they get very involved in defining exactly what religion is. But even the American Constitution is an outlier. Most countries, I shouldn't say, I think a majority, but if not close to that, actually have some kind of provision for official religions in their constitutions. This is not unusual. And so the reason I go into all that is to say that the association between constitution writing and this wall of separation is actually a little bit, I don't think it works all that well globally. All Arab constitutions, with the exception of Lebanon, establish an official religion. But by doing so, they are participating in something global. They're not unusual in that regard. What is unusual about Arab constitutions in comparative perspective is not that they get into religion. Again, even the American Constitution does that by trying not to do it. It still does it. It's unusual in the ways that they do so, and the number of structures that they do. One of the chief ways, of course, I've already referred to, is an official religion. They make an official religion of Islam. And a lot of the reason for that is that constitution writing is often seen as not simply a fundamental legal document, but a fundamental declaration of identity of a political community. So when you write a constitution, you're not simply setting up a political system. What you are doing is, in a sense, constituting a people. And so you put in their basic values. You put in all sorts of things that don't necessarily belong except in any symbolic sense, like where the country is. The Tunisian Constitution famously starts by saying that where the country is, as if they repealed that position, the country would float off into outer space. It would not. It's a symbolic provision, and an awful lot of the religious provisions are like that. They talk about the importance of the family, as if somehow you didn't have that, or somehow Arab families would dissolve if there weren't some kind of proclamation that the family is a basic unit of society. So an awful lot of them are symbolic, but some of them are institutional as well. Very often the head of state is required to be a Muslim. But there are also two other kinds of provisions which pack a little bit more punch. One is personal status law. It's very frequent for personal status law to be enshrined in a constitution as being on a religious basis. It's an interesting choice because, of course, traditional Islamic jurisprudence doesn't know a separate category called personal status law. This was a category of law that was invented as a distinct category in the 19th century, and a lot of it had to do with what happened when European powers got to the Middle East and said, essentially, we want to run this, this, and this, but family law, you can do that, carry on as you were. And so a separate and distinct category was set up, but it had the effect of tremendously elevating personal status law as being sort of the touchstone. That is, if personal status law is not done on a religious basis, then there would be strong pushback from all parts of the society. It says this is one area where states have to observe religion. And the other are sources of law clauses, most famous, beginning actually in Syria, then spreading to Kuwait, and then in Egypt, with the famous Article 2 that says the principles of the Islamic Sharia shall be the main source of legislation. What's interesting to me about these provisions is that what they tend to do is to take that kind of symbolic commitment of Islam and try to give it legal teeth. And they're interesting in that way. When I look at actually the way that they operate in practice, what has happened, I think, over the last generation or so in Arab constitution making is that people have tried to take those provisions much more seriously than in the past. Before, they were seen as sort of symbolic, but now they're seen as ones that may pack some power and may actually affect the way that legislation is written and applied on the ground. And at first glance, what this seems to do is to subordinate religion, subordinate the state in a sense to religion. It seems almost contradictory for a constitution that's issued in the name of the people, as virtually all constitutions are. Sometimes they're signed by a monarch, but for the most part they are issued in the name of the people. For a constitution that's in the name of the people, mentioning a source of law that's even higher than the people, that is God. So it seems to be a little contradictory. In fact, what I think it actually does is something a little bit more interesting and a little bit more complex. Because once you say that Sharia, the Islamic Sharia, shall somehow inform legislation, what you're doing is saying Islamic Sharia does not present itself as something that is immediately enacted into law. What that means is that you have to have regular legal and constitutional institutions decide how that's going to be done. And what that means, in a sense, is that when parliaments, when ministries of religious affairs, when state religious institutions, and so on, even when courts somehow get involved in this, what it's actually doing is, in a sense, not subordinating the state to religion so much as it's, I think, subordinating a lot of religion to the state, to mean that when the state speaks on these matters of personal status law, it is invoking a higher authority than itself. So it's kind of this odd thing. In a different paper, I once compared it to the state trying to take over the religious sphere, a little bit kind of like the elephant in the boa constrictor. It's not quite clear when the elephant swallows the boa constrictor exactly which beast is dominating the other.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Nathan is always a tough act to follow, but I'll try. Thank you to the Arab Center and for Nathan for inviting me as well. It's a pleasure to be here today. 6 years ago, when people took to the streets in the various Arab countries, they demanded human rights, whether they were political, social, cultural, or economic in many cases. But the reality is, looking at most of those countries, the countries that underwent some of the larger uprisings, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Bahrain, Yemen, and Syria, most of the countries' human rights records are actually poor, save for Tunisia. But there's one development that all these countries also had in common, and that was there was an attempt to either draft, whether it was successful or not, a constitution or constitutional amendment. So each of these countries underwent some sort of constitutional drafting process. In Tunisia, for example, there was a constituent assembly that was elected, went along a 2-year process, and produced a constitution that has been lauded across the region and actually across the world for how progressive it is in most regards. On the other hand, in Yemen, for example, there was a 17-member committee that was put together. That committee ultimately produced a constitutional draft, but it was never voted on because it is said that when the individual responsible for delivering that constitution was attempting to do so, he was kidnapped, and then the Houthi rebellion began. So that process, for example, stopped, although there were attempts. So all these countries attempted in some form or another to address the people's demands by putting forth new constitutions or new constitutional amendments. The question is, what is the content of these constitutions? Because it seems like the human rights records of these countries aren't so hot. So when you look at a human rights situation, it's, from a legal perspective, it's possible that the situation comes as a result of three different things. The draft of the Constitution or the Constitution, the governing principles of the law, laws themselves, specific laws, and then implementation of the laws. So there are three different things, really, when you look at the human rights record. I focus mostly on the first question, and that is, do these constitutions guarantee human rights? Something that will probably surprise a lot of the people in the room is that these constitutions are actually decent in the realm of human rights. And of course, they have their limitations, but are in no way even comparable to the situation on the ground. For the most part, these countries recognize the freedoms, like freedoms of religion, with some exceptions, of course, freedom of expression, freedom of association, all the rights that we recognize in our Bill of Rights here, but those rights fall short in practice. Focusing just on the Constitution right now, though, if you look at the Constitution of these 6 countries, you find provisions, for example, that guarantee equality of men and women, provisions that guarantee freedom from discrimination. However, there is no mention, of course, of sexual orientation, which is not rare across the world. That's not protected in a lot of constitutions. Tunisia and Egypt, for example, protect the right to freedom from discrimination. In Egypt, that right includes bases other than gender, sex, origin, language. It also says any other reason. So presumably you could protect marginalized groups that are not listed as well. And Tunisia doesn't specify the basis of discrimination, also presumably protecting those same rights. The status of women, for example, there are some forms of provisions in all of these constitutions that protect women to some degree. In Yemen, it's a little bit less clear. There's a really interesting provision, I thought, that says that women are the sisters of men. Really unclear what that means in legalese, but it is in that constitution. And in Tunisia, for example, it goes above and beyond, where it's protecting the amount of women that are going to be in elected assemblies, so sets forth a quota. So we have very different provisions in that regard. On the right to freedom of belief, and I won't touch on that too much because Nathan is discussing religion, but they all protect the right to freedom of belief, but when it comes to practice and worship, there's different implementation. Some countries protect all religions' ability to practice, and others, for example, like Egypt, protect only the revealed religions. So Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are the only religions that have their adherents have the right to actually go out and establish mosques or establish temples or establish churches. So there's a varied record in that realm as well. Freedom of expression and the press, for the most part, is protected. There are some provisions that will say, except during times of war or mobilization, or except in cases in Bahrain, for example, where sectarianism is not aroused. But there are these phrases that sort of limit the rights, and this kind of leads to the main point at hand, is that the constitutions, reading them on a face value, they're not that bad, but there are plenty of provisions and phrases in each of the constitutions that say, we guarantee the right to freedom of belief in accordance with the law, or subject to the principles of Sharia, or so long as public order is not harmed. Those are phrases that in the Arab world and in practice are used by both the implementers and the people setting forth the law to create exceptions and restrictions. A lot of the Arab constitutions don't explicitly have a limitations clause. Only Tunisia, I believe, and Egypt have these limitations clauses, but they all across the board have phrases that, like in accordance with the law, that you could presumably then have a constitution that guarantees the right to freedom of expression. And then months later, you have the parliament passing a social media law that then says you're not allowed to put out Facebook posts that insult the president in situations that harm public order. Those two things are not mutually exclusive because they were protecting the right to freedom of expression in accordance with the law. So it leaves a lot in the hands of parliamentarians and in the hands of judges who interpret that law. And really that's the source of problems in these constitutions. That's not to say that if we were to remove all the vague phrases in these 6 Arab constitutions that these countries would have wonderful human rights records. Obviously, like I said, there's still the laws that are occurring outside of the Constitution, and there's still the implementation of such. But any sort of reform project or human rights reform project will need to also incorporate a way to address these sort of vague provisions in the constitutions.
Okay, thank you. Where do you both see the next phase of this constitutional movement, if you will, in the Arab world, in light of the demise of Arab Spring, if you will, and awaiting maybe the second wave of that down the road, as anticipated by some. But where do you see the future of this attempt at constitutionalizing, if you will, the legal systems in the Arab world?
Okay. Short term, not great. Again, with the possible exception of Tunisia. What was extraordinary about the moment of 2011, not just in Egypt, but in Tunisia and elsewhere as well, was the way in which political demands were quickly rendered for a lot of people, not for everybody, but in constitutional terms, right? We want to limit the power of the presidency, we want real freedoms, we want to put in constitutional provisions, even ones that were about social justice issues. We want to put in distribution requirements, we want to put in a requirement that the state spend a certain proportion of the budget on education and so on. We want to bar military trials and so on. So there was a quick translation from the political sphere to the constitutional sphere in a way that's actually unusual politically. To some extent, I follow Tunisia much less closely, but that process seems to be continuing a little bit as you've got this constitution in place, and it puts in some mechanisms that are now being, the details are now being sketched in. For the rest of the Arab world, I think, you've got countries like Yemen and Syria where at this point they're not in the middle of constitutional negotiations, and this is not a struggle about exactly how you draft the freedom of the press or how you define religion, state in constitutional terms. And even in Egypt, where you don't have the sort of collapse of a state, I think there's a lot of dissolution with what a constitution can do. So my own take would be that at this point, the Arab world had kind of this constitutional moment, actually stretching a few years before 2011, and then after 2011, that moment's over, and it may be another generation before that kind of struggle is picked up again.
May, would you like to comment on the current research in terms of comparing the different Arab countries? Definitely, they all had a different pattern, but they had some common ingredients, if you will. How would you compare this recent wave of attempting to influence and rewrite their constitutions with past attempts, if you will, regardless of which phase in the past?
Sure. I think one really interesting thing is that many of these all these countries, like I was saying, were attempting to pass new constitutions or did pass new constitutions. What's very interesting is that the human rights provisions of these constitutions did not change much. There are, especially in the case of Tunisia, new distribution and socioeconomic provisions, but in a lot of the countries, Egypt, for example, many of the rights have stayed largely the same. In fact, there's an interesting anecdote where in Egypt, for example, previously under the 1971 Constitution, the right to freedom of assembly was allowed without notice. Now in Egypt, there's a notice requirement, so it's almost like going backwards from a human rights perspective. There's a lot of interesting little developments like that. For example, military trials were not always addressed. Now in Egypt, for example, they're explicitly allowed in some cases, and there was an expansion, if you will, of the situations in which military trials can occur in Egypt under the latest constitution. So it's not necessarily all going forward, because many of the governments, I think, at least, for example, with the case of Syria, address the demands of the people by addressing maybe the term limits of the president or the political structure. human rights itself was not a lens by which these governments looked at a way to push constitutional drafting. So many of these constitutions, I think, have stayed largely the same, and I would agree with Nathan's analysis that the moment almost for constitutional change is not right now, is not for a while probably. There was a moment, like he was saying. I think there will be maybe little efforts. In Egypt, there's a lot of promising efforts to challenge individual laws per the constitution and to reinterpret kind of the way that laws are being viewed, and we can talk about that as well. But for example, the protest law, and there's an attempt to reanalyze some of the freedom of expression provisions to bring them up to par with the Constitution. For example, in Egypt, there's the famous case of Ahmed Naji, the novelist who was arrested for harming public morality for his novel. It is not allowed under the Egyptian Constitution to hold someone in prison for any expression offenses. You can issue a fine, but you're not allowed to sentence them. Egyptian law occurs in contravention to that constitutional provision, and there are attempts, for example, to challenge that and to challenge laws. So there are little battles that I think we will see possibly succeeding, but I think a huge constitutional drafting process is unlikely.
Okay, and to both of you, as researchers, are we entitled as researchers or analysts to kind of give the region, if you will, a break in terms of cultural background, in terms of history, or do we need to apply standards that are internationally accepted and uniform in terms of the content of these constitutions that we see in the Arab world?
Just briefly, I mean, every country will have a different constitution based on its context, and that's only natural, but all of these countries have agreed and signed on to an international system. They've signed most of the primary international human rights treaties, whether that's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or cultural, social, and economic rights. So they all have obligations. Whether those obligations are written in the Constitution or not, they still exist in the international scheme. And obviously, we have issues with adhering to international law, but those obligations still exist. So in my personal opinion, I would say there are some things that are really non-negotiable, especially in the realm of human rights.
Analytically, I would basically agree. I mean, you've got, not only are states that have committed themselves internationally, but I would say actually if you take a look at most constitutional texts in the Arab world, there are ones that are very similar in form to those of European states, right? I mean, you'll find the same provisions in the same places, sometimes the same language, and so on. So they're participating in something that is international. It is certainly the case that the degree to which these documents effectively guarantee the kinds of things that the constitutions in Europe guarantee is much less. But the problem in my mind isn't cultural, it is political, that these are constitutions that are operating in authoritarian systems. If you have, for instance, a constitutional provision, I will take actually one example that May gave. The provision that says, we'll give you freedom of expression, freedom of the press, as defined by law, as guaranteed by law, is one that seems to promise with the Constitution one thing and then take back with legislation the other. The origin of that phrasing is actually post-revolutionary France, and the reason was, when you say law, that means it has to go by a parliament. It has to be passed by the people's representatives. So what that Constitution is saying, in essence, is like, there's going to be freedom of the press, that the executive, that the monarch cannot take away, that only the people represented in Parliament can decide what freedom of the press means. Well, of course, you transfer that to a context in which you've got a ruling party with a guaranteed majority, and all of a sudden it means the regime is, by saying it's guaranteed by law, you basically mean that the Ministry of Interior gets to draft up the legislation and present it to the Parliament, which will rubber stamp it. So that's a political problem. It's not a cultural problem, and that's what's robbing an awful lot of these constitutions, or taking these constitutions that are homologous and look somewhat similar, and making them operate in a much more authoritarian manner.
Okay, before we move forward to the question and answer session, may I ask you in just 2 to 3 minutes, kind of concluding remarks in response to either what the other speaker has said, or generally speaking, to summarize your perspective?
All
right.
2 to 3 minutes. Academics talking like
That's right.
50-minute soundbite. So
Your time is up.
yeah. I would just say, yeah, in terms of what I'm hearing from May in terms of human rights provisions, I think what she's telling is actually, I would agree, it's a fairly accurate picture of states that commit themselves to human rights provisions in the bold print, but you read the fine print and you find out something very different going on.
Okay, May?
Hard to follow that. No, I mean, everything Nathan has said I agree with, and the assessment of where we're going almost really points to the next event of this series being let's talk about law or let's talk about practice, and almost stepping away from the constitutions, which I hate to do because we love reading constitutions, but it's almost like the next, where change is going to come is not really from these constitutions. It will need to come from whether it's the political systems or the people on the ground or the legislation that's passed in Parliament, or it's the actually appointing people or electing people to Parliament who can hold their governments accountable. So it's almost, the Constitution is important, but it's not, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient.
All right, let's move to the question and answer session. I'd like to begin with George Sellen. He's a member of our board of directors, a founding member of the board of directors of the center here, and an authority on labor law in this country, which he has been practicing for many years in Washington.
Thank you, Khalil, and thanks to both speakers. Is this on?
Yeah.
Good. I have a great deal of experience in the region. And my experience, going back to my time with the Reagan-Bush administration, is not what's written on the books. I remember in labor law in Egypt in the 80s, the laws were excellent and guaranteed a great deal of individual freedoms and liberties. It's the implementation. It's the, quote, rule of law, end quote, and the system of how the laws are administered. You know, we in this country take the Constitution as the source document, and all of our laws are derived from that, and nothing can conflict with it. That's not the case, I think, in the Middle East. I just returned last night from a trip to the region, of which the first 5 days was in Tunisia. I can tell you Tunisia today is dysfunctional, absolutely dysfunctional. However, people will say despite the dysfunction, the people feel as if they have their voice. So they're willing to work through it, and that's a good thing. But it's quite extraordinary that the level of bureaucracy remains. And again, I think there needs to be implementation of a rule of law there that will enable the system to work. And that's still a process. But my question to both of you is, don't you find not the issue to be one of constitution, but more one of implementation and respect for the rule of law? And should we be focusing more on that?
I agree with you that implementation is very important, and that's how that's what ultimately matters. But at the same time, from a legal perspective, I think you have let's take an example. In Egypt, for example, prior to maybe a certain set of laws, the counterterrorism law is a good example. You could insult the president, and you could then be charged, but you would be sentenced and tried. And there's a very good chance that even though you would be put through this huge ordeal of torture and arrest, et cetera, you could challenge that. And there were laws to enable you to challenge that. Now, for example, there's a counterterrorism law that makes it legal for all those things to happen. So while implementation is important, the law itself is necessary, because you don't want to normalize human rights violations, and you don't want to normalize human rights abuses. It's not enough, like you're saying, but it's necessary. So we have to ensure that that exists. Whether we ensure that first or second, that can be debated, the order in which you do that, but you really do have to have the law to prevent the normalization, I would say, of violations.
But that's not a constitutional issue, is it?
It's not a constitutional issue necessarily, but the Constitution is where a lot of the laws emanate from, and it's sort of a combination of a lot of things. So
Nathan, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would sort of put it on two levels. There's a sort of a basic political level where I think you're right, and that's in a sense going back to what I said earlier. The problem is that the structures are not there effectively that can take vague constitutional language and apply them. So theoretically, all legislation has to be in accordance with the Constitution. In practice, to actually work that out, if it goes against the core regime interest, it's going to be very difficult. That's sort of on political levels. On other kinds of levels, you're talking about labor law or real estate law and so on. To me, what is the problem, and I've only looked at this in Egypt and a little bit in Kuwait, is you've got this incredibly complicated framework in what is still a poor society, and the result is that you've got courts absolutely clogged. And this isn't the regime saying, for instance, we really care about who owns this little store, way out in the middle of nowhere. But it means for an ordinary citizen to get your rights enforced by a court is such a complicated procedure, and involves potentially years of civil litigation. That the rule of law is missing, not because of any political blockage, but simply because of the questions of legal complexity and basic resources.
Okay, Saeed Rakat, and you worked actually for the United Nations in Iraq during the period when there were an attempt to write the Constitution.
Right, I worked on...
What's your impression of what we've been discussing?
This is it. I mean, I worked on the Iraqi Constitution, and I can tell you it was from the very beginning designed to keep going the sectarian strife and so on. So it has so many pitfalls, and it had, it brought in elements, as the articles of the Constitution, like Article 140, I think Nathan is probably aware of the Article 130 that gives the people of Kirkuk, for instance, the ability to decide for themselves, or things that are throughout the Constitution, article after article, that basically suggest that, while Iraq is part of the Arab world, and its Arab citizens are members of that Arab world, suggesting that there may be other groups and ethnic groups and so on. So it was, this is the point. I wonder if you can really have a functioning constitution when you have such a strife, in the absence of stability with the onset of sectarian strife and internecine strife and so on. So, and of course, to add to that, I don't believe that you can have a constitution which is really the rule of man, so to speak, when you have such an overwhelming presence for religion, when you say that Islam is the state religion. So these are the things that Arabs must face. And I think, anything short of facing this courageously and coming up with realities, you are not going to be able to have constitutions that are basically civil laws that you can, regulate the people's relations to one another. So, I want to add my voice to what George said, that, what you need, at least in this transition, until such time when you have, stabilities and so on in these societies, that you must have some sort of a set of laws where people can deal with one another. But I can assure you that the Iraqi Constitution that we worked on, that came out in 2005, October 2005, it was, was inferior to, let's say, to the Constitution that was introduced in 1925, under the British, or even the Constitution that was really never brought to be implemented in 1990. So that's what you have, and that's as a result of this strife, and as a result of the interference of foreign powers, in that case, like the United States of America. Thank you.
Thank you, Saeed. Any comment on his comment? Okay, Muhammad. I guess we have a lot of Muhammads here. Yeah, go ahead.
See you, in Egypt, during over the past 7 years, we have 2 constitutional amendments, 2 constitutions. So the first constitutional amendment with the military junta, and then Morsi came with a new constitution, and then he made constitutional amendment, and then with Sisi there's a new constitution. So how do you see the, is constitution is changeable? Can we change constitution with each regime or with each government? And the second, also, how to make sure that the government abide by the constitution, because you have sweet words in the constitution about freedom, but you see the government is violating all human rights and freedom. So how to maintain a collective driving force to ensure that the government abide by the constitution? Thank you.
Go ahead, Nana.
I'm going to try and answer those questions, pull in Saeed's and pull in something that May said, and do it succinctly. May said something very interesting that may have been missed. She said, essentially, the Egyptian constitution, the current one, 2014, is fairly similar to its previous ones, right? The 2014 constitution, written basically with military oversight, and anti-Muslim Brotherhood political forces, and the one written in 2012, written essentially under Muslim Brotherhood oversight, and the one written in 1971, written at a time when the Arab Socialist Union was the only political party. You put these side by side, yeah, there are differences, but they're small. So why all this incredible tumult and very little textual change? And Saeed said, you know, you go back to 1925 and you actually kind of see the same kind of outline. The problem here, it seems to me, is one, is much process as it is the content of the of the document itself. That these are documents that were produced by single political forces, or they were seen by them as being produced by single political forces. The Egyptian regime of 1971, the Muslim Brotherhood made the extent to which it made constitutional changes was very slight, but the extent to which this was seen as Morsi's constitution basically made everybody line up on it. To have a real constitutional process is one in which various political forces and social forces come together and manage to hammer a document. That is a very, very difficult process. They've tried in several countries. They tried in Yemen, and essentially the political process collapsed. They tried in Tunisia, and they had some success. Whether the success will be successful, we'll see. I mean, the jury is still out. You say it's a dysfunctional country. But that's the missing ingredient. That's a missing ingredient in Egypt. That was a missing ingredient in Iraq. Yes, there are all kinds of textual problems. But the real problem is the process that produced them, I think.
Okay, Hamad Awais.
Thank you, Khalil. Thank you, Mai and Nathan. Let me move a little bit away from what we are talking about and talk about historically America, the European Union, were the gatekeepers of democracy and human rights. It was perceived like that, plus the protocols of the United Nations. Fast forward, Mr. Trump is the president of the United States. The Europeans are no good, NATO is no good, the Arabs are no good. Until yesterday, Muslims were no good. So who is the gatekeeper here? If we here in the United States are having problems even with our constitution and the derailment of many laws and trying to really abuse the American laws or rewrite stuff in order to become an evangelist country, like Mr. Trump wants it to be elected maybe in 2020, is it? So Muhammad's question there is very important, but yeah, but we talk about all these governments, leaders who rewrite the constitution to match to what their needs are to stay in power, them and their party. But since the 2011 and Trump leadership, I think there is no hope for us Arabs in really moving forward with anything. Especially Trump is there now, and we did not hear anything about civil liberties, about human rights, about Palestinian rights, about Syria. We did not hear him mention Syria or Iraq. Oh, he wants to fight ISIS. I want to fight ISIS. The king of Saudi Arabia wants to fight ISIS. Maybe sometimes ISIS want to fight ISIS, and Nusra wants to fight ISIS. But who is the gatekeeper now? Or do we have any future? I mean, when I say we, all of us, the world community, especially if Mr. Trump succeeds in breaking down the United Nations, European Union, the NATO, and the alliance with the Arabs.
Toughie.
Really easy question.
Yeah.
Maybe a statement.
Maybe. From a principle perspective, I'd like to think that when it comes to human rights, we don't really need a gatekeeper. We know the principles.
Good
All these countries, all these governments, irrespective of who they are and where they are, know what needs to go in the Constitution, what the human rights are. So it's really, I don't fear from a constitutional perspective the situation, to be honest. I think the Constitution in the US will stay the same, and I think the constitutions in the Arab world are unlikely to change for a while as well. And I don't think that that's really the source of where we're going to see much human rights change, at least.
Okay, the gentleman back here, yes.
So I've got a question about, maybe if you could talk a little bit about how some of the provisions got into the constitutions before the 2011 uprisings, particularly given the role that regimes had in constitution making. And the extent to which these provisions were generated from domestic political calculations and international political calculations. I know it's a big question.
I'll start. There's a lot of provisions, but what I would say here, I'll give sort of a thumbnail sketch. I mean, the 19th century constitutions, which you made reference to, tend to resemble European constitutions, and especially European constitutions of a specific kind. The Belgian Constitution was very popular, and one of the reasons was it established a monarchy, but also a parliament. So it seemed to be a good way of kind of combining these two things. That makes it sound as if they're international, but there was a strong domestic motivation behind these documents, and that was you had the perception that you had spendthrift rulers who really needed some kind of measure of oversight from not necessarily a completely democratic structure, but some people who were interested, who had the public interest in mind. So it was really about fiscal responsibility, an awful lot of those. So that's how the basic outlines of these constitutions were established, and that's why it is that the outline and a lot of the provisions resemble European ones in form. But then you go over time, and you've got different periods of constitution writing. I would say you went through a period, really in sort of the mid-20th century, when you had primarily authoritarian regimes. These were not constitutions, therefore, about constituting a political system. The regime was in place, and it took a look at the constitution and said, what can we do in order to use this? And they tended to get very ideological. They treated it like the same way the Communist Party would at the end of a party congress. Like, we're going to announce basic ideological provisions. So that's when you get an awful lot of the fulsome language about prosperity, public sector, leading role of the public sector, this sort of thing in these documents. And they start getting very, very long as a result. What is interesting to me about the last 5 years of this constitutional moment, which now I say and may agree is over, is for the first time I think you really had very strong popular engagement in the documents, and you really had some kind of I would say kind of social and political dialogue among political forces about it. It didn't result in very happy outcomes in most cases, but that's what's distinctive about that period.
I should have said specifically the human rights provisions in the Constitution. So you're going back to 71, you're going back, I mean, is this sort of half dependence from earlier kind of 20th century constitution building where you have, like, for example, in Egypt, the conference party, or where did the sort of human rights provisions sort of start coming in, and to what extent were they domestic versus international kind of calculus there?
Very quickly for each of you, make an add to this. Article 2. Well, Article 2 is really about Islam, though, right? But if you talk about the human rights ones, So they kind of get in, but they're basically political rights from 19th century Europe. Okay, so that's that. Then mid-century, you have socialist governments coming in, and so they add in this level of social and economic rights that hadn't been there before. But these are aspirational. It's not quite clear if they're going to be implemented in any kind of way. So that's when they start getting longer. And then you have this interesting 2011 period when people start actually asking, wait a second, let's not just list rights. Let's figure out who's responsible for defining them, and so on. So you have much more sophisticated discussions, I think, but that's not until fairly recently. That would be kind of my capsule.
Yeah, and very lengthy constitutions in all these countries. Like, our constitution is very short. The Egyptian constitution is about, I think, 241 articles or something like that.
Yeah.
And all of them are similarly long and have transitional provisions that will go out of effect very shortly, like all sorts of level of detail. But I think you're right that the extra provisions sort of expanding on the rights came in very recently, and almost out of a sense of we want to be as detailed as possible. By some analysts' observations, almost in an inappropriate manner. Like these constitutions are really lengthy in a manner that sort of defies what most other older constitutions look like.
Right here.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Al-Shwaiter. I used to work with the drafting Yemeni constitution during 2014 as a constitutional assistant. And through my short experience with the committee, because it was after a conflict, so the Constitution Committee will try to satisfy all groups, so it's become like patchwork. There is lack of the coherence of the Constitution. And in my experience, the problem with the Yemeni Constitution in this period of time wasn't regarding the relation between the religion and state. It was about the federalism in this period of time. However, back in 1994, when the unification between the South and the North, the main problem was what been so-called the constitution battlefield between the Islamist and the secular about the relationship between the state and the religion. And in most of Arab and Muslim states, it's not about to be a clear secular or Islamist. It's about is Sharia is the only source or the main source. So I think most of the Islamic countries, they don't say we are a clear secular state. Is it the problem? Is the argument is the Sharia is the main source or one of the sources? And so here the point when the Constitution 2014 we passed that, but I have in my opinion, if we will mention that the Sharia will be, although I'm in favor of that, for the secular state, but by saying that if Islamic, let's say for Yemen example, or most of the other Islamic countries as well, if the elites gonna push for a clear secular state, that might be a justification for the radical or the traditional groups to justify their movement to recruit people, to push back, to we are now get out of the Sharia, so gonna create a lot of problems. However, I guess in the experience of Yemen, in the end, after long debate, the president passed that the Sharia will be the main source. The question here, is that gonna be a problem? Let's say, the question will be, is mentioning the Sharia can be fit with observing the human rights in the international standard? Can we do that? We, mention that it's based on the Sharia law, but at the same time preserve the human rights in international standard.
Thank you. May, I think that.
Well, I want Nathan to just talk about the Sharia
Yeah.
aspect, but I'll jump in.
I think actually yes. It depends on exactly how it's done, but these provisions tend to be very, very general, right? And if, as a result of that, you hammer out language, I'll go back to the process issues, you hammer out language that really makes all political forces feel like they have a stake in the system that it produces, and you have some kind of compromise language on the Sharia, then I think that is a healthy outcome, one that will allow a politics to develop that could support the other human rights provisions of the Constitution. The only time I think you get into real difficulty is not with the Sharia provision per se. There was a provision, for instance, in women's rights provisions in the 1971 Egyptian Constitution that said this will be women shall have full, I can't remember, social and economic, I don't think it said political rights, it's civil rights,
no,
within, as long as these do not contradict the rulings, ahkam, of the Sharia. Then you start getting into detail. But if you just say principles of the Sharia or the Sharia, that to me is not much of a problem. When you get into specific rulings, then somebody can, that's where you begin, and that's where states begin to resort to things like saying women are the sisters of men as a way of saying, well, we need some kind of gender provision. Let's have one that can mean anything you want it to mean. And then we'll have a gender provision, it won't change anything. When you start talking detail, when you start talking ahkam, then you start really restricting what those human rights provisions could mean. That would be my answer.
No, I agree fully. I think that the first thing that came to my mind is saying Sharia is a source of law or as an inspiration or as adherence to the principles of Sharia. Keeping it vague, it's very possible to also adhere to all the human rights obligations that most of these countries have. And I agree that once you get into the detail and once you get into the specific legislation and then also the interpretation of such, you start to get into a little bit of murkier situations. And but there is a way to honor all of the obligations. There's a question of what it will look like in practice, and I think that will be a case-by-case basis for each country.
Radwan, you just got back. You had your hand up earlier, and you just got back also from Tunis. Is Tunis dysfunctional? Why?
That was going to be the first part of my comment.
All right.
I disagree that Tunisia is dysfunctional. It certainly is the case that we do not have a strong state. So to people who are used to a strong state controlling everything in the country, it may look like dysfunctional, even to many Tunisians. But I think that's by design. I think we don't want a strong state because we know what a strong state means. It will prevent any real democratization in the country. So we are in a transition to democracy. My first point is we have to understand that transitions take time, at least 15 years to 20 years. All of the countries that have been through transition to democracy took that long. If you study any country in the world that went from dictatorship to democracy, it took them minimum 15 to 20 years. So that's my first point. There is a transition that takes time. And writing the constitution is a step in that transition. It's not everything. And it certainly, in terms of legal framework, I don't think it's that important because, as you mentioned, we had good constitutions in the Arab world before the Arab revolutions, and the new constitutions are not that different from the old constitutions, certainly in Tunisia, but I think even in Egypt. What the problem is translating that constitution into laws, first of all, and there are thousands of laws that have to be changed. So that is a very time-consuming process. But then even if you change the laws, it doesn't mean that the laws are going to be respected. So then it takes even more time to change the culture and the institutions for people to start respecting those laws. The most important thing about the Constitution is not the Constitution itself. It's the process of arriving at the Constitution. It's the dialogue that takes place before we come up to, we write the Constitution. And that's what is important. It's uniting the people. It's the dialogue between all the various groups and parties to come to a consensus. And if you don't do that right, of course, you end up dividing the country and civil war. And if you do it right, then you can move forward.
Okay, thank you, Radwan. I would like to end with my colleague, Abdul Wahab Al-Qassab, who covers the Iraq portfolio for us here at the center, to make either a comment or a question real quick. We have 2 minutes.
A little comment. Thank you very much, Khalid. Thank you, Nathan and May. I think the problem is not writing a constitution. We have written a lot of very nicely written constitution in the Arab world. I think the problem is first on two parts, two factors. The first factor on the part of the government, how they are going to implement the provisions of the constitution. The second and the most important factor pertains to the people. Is there really a constitutional culture built up all over the time to force the government to respect and implement the constitution in a right way? I think this is the problem. And this is the factor which makes all the constitutional movement in the Arab world comes into void. We had, by the beginning of the century, a very vast freedom of speech. Everybody who was in Baghdad, in Cairo, in Damascus, was talking about, for example, the freedom of women. I mean, there was a movement, Qasim Amin in Egypt, Zahawi in Iraq. But what came after that, by the end of the 20th century, is this type of, what was the present Iraqi constitution gives to the people. Segregation, all sort of, hatred, and everything which you are seeing in Iraq now. I think, again, in two words, it is on the part of the people to have the cultural, the constitutional culture, and of the government, how they respect and implement the provisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since this is being broadcast, you notice we started on time, and I'd like to end it on time. We have 2 more seconds, so thank you all very much for being here today. Appreciate it. Mai, Nathan?